The full episode is now available on Patreon and YouTube memberships. Please see the link in the description for more details.
And we are back to talk about what's happening in the news, some of the latest stuff regarding Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, all that good stuff. And there's quite a bit of it, actually, since we've last convened. It's been a minute, actually, since we've last convened. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Kicking it old school, keeping it real.
Okay, so there's a lot to get to. But the first thing we have to get to is I think it's a little important, even though for whatever reason, I mean, I know the reason, but I noticed a lot of the fandom really doesn't like Elio and Linda, and I feel like it's mostly on the latter half than the former. But Elio recently did an interview with a YouTube channel, Culturescape, and it was quite an enlightening one. I'm going to have like my own video on it where I go into like every detail. But two of the things popped up that I thought was interesting that we could discuss here. The first being a question that Elio goes into, and it's one that's thrown at you quite often, which is, do you think George is having a hard time writing the last two books because of the reception to the end of Game of Thrones? And the other question he got asked is, do any of the major theories in the fandom do they have any merit? Did people like Preston, who theory crack some of the mysteries George has laid out? So which ones do you want to tackle first?
Let's talk about whether the end of Game of Thrones is affecting George's like mindset. By
the way, before I continue on, I just want to explain who Elio is in case some of the people listening in don't know. Yeah. But he and his wife Linda, they're basically the original superfans who created the first major fan website, and they've also collaborated with George multiple times and even worked on the world of Ice and Fire with him. So if George had like a small council, they would have a seat at that table, very close to the man himself. But in regards to George having a hard time finishing it because of the show's ending, Elio implies that a lot of what we saw in the final season was within George's outline for how to all play out in the books, and he mentioned Daenerys specifically, how her going mad and doing all those bad things seems to be the intention. He references her last Dance of Dragons chapter where she realizes she isn't made for peace, she's made for war, fire and blood, but he criticized the show for how rushed and sloppy they came to that point with the character. I find this interesting because a lot of the fandom didn't really like the turn of Daenerys to evil, and I get it, it's because, again, it was rushed and all that, but the idea that she could ever be a bad guy, rushed or not, is something a lot of people reject. They thought it was fan fiction from Dave and Dan.
Right. I mean, I think people had a real tough time with that. And so I would say a lot of people had a real tough time with that switch because the show spends a lot more time than the book does making Dany into a hero. One can argue about whether or not like the book does that. Like, you know, it's very clearly when you're reading Storm, Dany comes off a bit evil. And then it kind of gets walked back in Dance because there's a lot less action, and she's just kind of more clueless in Dance than she is in Storm, where, you know, in Storm, she's ordering the deaths of 13-year-old children, you know, and crucifying people and burning people and all sorts of things. And then that's all walked back in Dance, where she's all of a sudden, you know, not that evil and trying to rule kind of justly. And though bad things happen, like she does accidentally she does order the torture of somebody, but it doesn't come off as being as angry and dictator-like as her actions in Storm. So I can understand why, but if you watch the show, every time Dany does stuff, there's majestic music of people watching her on her dragon, you know, and all of the characters talking about how she's so inspiring, you know, Tyrion and Jorah and even Grey Worm and Missandei and things like this, you know. So the show built her up to be more of a hero, and so when it did drop her hard into being a villain, and you know, they felt a little betrayed because it wasn't just like they weren't just looking at the action. Like the show had clearly framed Dany as a hero with its music and direction and the characters around her, Like we were supposed to believe that she was a hero, and then all of a sudden, nope, the rug was pulled from underneath us. That build up, there hasn't been as much of it in the book. I'm not saying there hasn't been some, but there hasn't been as much. You know, I mean, being in her head in a point of view, is a build up of her being good, but it's just not as much. There's no majestic music with long speeches from Tyrion and Jorah about how like revolutionary she was, you know.
I mean, if we got to see things from Thanos' point of view and they added some inspirational music there and we got to see like what he was thinking, then maybe,
right.
You know.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a bit of that. But yeah, no, it's interesting that then there's the question of, if it were not so rushed, would it come across better? Well, I think everything comes across better when it's not rushed. But you know, can George pull the turn even? Because like even for George, you know, he's only got 2 books, you know, left. Could he pull the turn?
I'm glad you mentioned that because we're going to get in that in a minute. But Elio says how Dave and Dan, they knew George's like outline to getting to the end, but he noted how it felt like Dave and Dan had a different philosophical view of what was going on. So despite the last seasons containing George's ideas, Dave and Dan, from what he's seen and what he's discussed with George, it seemed like Dave and Dan interpreted it much differently than what was intended. He brings up Bran being king in the end and how that sounds sinister, that you have this all-knowing guy that can see what everyone is doing, and that isn't really George's idea or what George intended. And to me, it sounds like Dave and Dan put their own spin on things, and the end product would be similar beats but have different iterations than what George really wanted. Now, it kind of sounds like, correct if I'm going a little off with this, kind of sounds like how every time we get like a new Batman story or a new Spider-Man story, it's Spider-Man, it's Peter Parker, it's Bruce Wayne as Batman, but like there's always a different spin on some of the characters and how the characters come up, you know?
Right.
Like how in Tim Burton's Batman, the Penguin is this like monster who was abandoned and so forth, and he's literally like a physical monster. And then in the Penguin show, the Batman Cinematic Universe, the Penguin, Robin Pattinson, Penguin's just like a dude from Jersey who's just kind of a piece of shit.
Yeah.
So it's basically the same character, kinda, but like different iterations and different spins on it. That seems like what he was going for here. George has his own version of how things will play out, and Dave and Dan had their own spin, their own different iteration on how these things should be and how they should play out.
Well, it's pretty inescapable that every artist wants to have their own mark. I don't think you can have a human being not want their own mark, you know, on something, unless they're just truly they're trying to counterfeit it, do a counterfeit kind of thing. But that's just how things go. There's kind of this trope with vampire movies that the vampire movie always starts with someone saying, vampires aren't like how they are in the movies. And then they explain how their vampires in this story are different from all the rest of the vampire stories. So, you know, with Twilight, the vampires are going to be sparkling in the sunshine, you know, or whatever. But they always have that this isn't like in the movies. Vampires are different because they all have to have their own spin. So yeah, Dan and Dave are going to have their own mark. You know, there's definitely a different feel of Game of Thrones to A Song of Ice and Fire, of course. Even in the early seasons that are good, they definitely still just have a completely different feel.
It reminds me a lot of, because we all love Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. To me, it's like the gold standard of adaptations. But didn't the Tolkien estate hate the shit out of it? Didn't Tolkien's son, Christopher, hate it?
Sure, but they hate everything. I mean, even I remember seeing an interview with the grandson, and somebody's like, "Oh, what do you think Tolkien would think of this? Would he hate it?" And he's like, "I mean, honestly, my grandfather hated everything. I mean, he even admitted that like he hated everything. I mean, nothing is going to be good enough."
To wrap this segment up, Elio firmly believes that George isn't really struggling to finish Winds, not because of the show, but because he's mostly trying to put himself in a position where after Winds of Winters comes out, there's only one more book. So Yeah, what do you make of that? Because I know you think there's going to be at least 2 more after Winds.
Well, I mean, that's a fancy way to say that he's just struggling with the story. I mean, I also agree that I think a lot of us look at the show and how disastrous it was, and we think that like that would have emotionally hurt George, and it might have put him in a funk, and that's true. But I think that it's such a minor issue compared to all of the other things that are holding him back, which is, I think the big thing is distraction.
Yeah, that's easily the biggest thing. Yeah, and George mentions it himself.
Yeah, and George says it himself. He has a real tough time writing outside his house, and if he has one other thing going on in his life, he's done. And if he doesn't have a deadline, like really driving him, he's done. I don't think it's what Elio said, only because like he wants to put the story in a position where he can finish in 7 books. No, I think if he were on a writing tear, he would write The Winds of Winter and then be like, it's going to be 8 books. Like, I think that's much more likely than I've got to be efficient and structure the story in a way to make sure that the 7th book is gonna finish. Because look at it this way. Like, it's been 13 years. Okay. He could have easily, if it were what Elio's saying, he could have easily in that time period of 13 years written 2 books and been less efficient and less economical, and then made it 8 books. He could have easily just done that if it were all about like, if he's fine with writing, but it's all about, length isn't really the issue here. He could write as much as he wants. Everyone would be happy the more he writes. He'd be like Robert Jordan, just writing book after book after book. I think the problem is the distractions. The problem is that he just can't find the time to sit down and actually write this shit.